The noble consciousness, being the extreme which is the self, appears as the source of the language by which the sides of the relation are shaped into animated wholes. The heroism of silent service becomes the heroism of flattery. This vocal reflection of service constitutes the spiritual self-separating middle term and reflects back into itself not only its own extreme, but also reflects back into this self the extreme of universal power, making that power, which is at first only implicit, into a power that is explicit with an existence of its own, makes it into a self-conscious individuality. The result is that the spirit of this power is now an unlimited monarch, unlimited because the language of flattery raises this power into its purified universality. This moment being the product of language, of an existence which has been purified into spirit, is a purified self-identity, a monarch, for such language likewise raises individuality to its extreme point. What the noble consciousness divests itself of as regards this aspect of the simple spiritual unity is the pure intrinsic being of its thinking, its very I. Expressed more definitely, it raises the individuality, which otherwise is only a presumed existence, into the existence of its pure form, by giving the monarch his own proper name. For it is in the name alone that the difference of the individual from everyone else is not presumed, but is made actual by all. In the name, the individual counts as a pure individual, no longer only in his own consciousness, but in the consciousness of everyone. By his name, then, the monarch is absolutely separated off from everyone else, exclusive and solitary. As monarch, he is a unique atom that cannot impart any of its essential nature. This name is thus the reflection into self, or the actuality which the universal power has in its own self. Through the name, the power is the monarch. Conversely, he, this particular individual, thereby knows himself, this individual, to be the universal power, knows that the nobles are not only ready and prepared for the service of the state power, but that they group themselves round the throne as an ornamental setting, and that they are continually telling him who sits on it what he is. Here in paragraph 511, we see Hegel now returning to the thematic of language, and he's going to talk about one modality of language in particular, translated as flattery, Schmeichelei, right? This form of language in which one reduces oneself while increasing something else. And this is going to lead us to the unlimited monarch, the absolute monarch, you could say. I think what he has in mind here are the sorts of claims that were being made not only by, say, Louis XIV, but also by some of the English kings and other monarchs who had similar pretensions. What's going on here is really a jockeying for power, and not simply political power, but a different, deeper, you might say, sort of power reflected in the speech acts of language themselves between the people belonging to the noble class, who presumably are motivated by this noble consciousness, which could include those who rise up through the ranks, show a certain heroism. He talks about the heroism of service, and the growing power of the state encapsulated in the person who is at the apex, at least in some cases as a figurehead, because there could be other powers behind the throne. So Hegel says this noble consciousness appears as the source of the language by which the sides of the relation are shaped into animated wholes. What is he talking about there? You notice that we've got a somewhat similar schema here on the board as that in the previous paragraph, except what I've done is sort of turn things 90 degrees so that state power was, previously split into these two things, the abstract universal, the common good, right? and then the will that had to actually decide things. And this will was, in certain ways, not quite formulated yet. It's going to start getting its formulation, its articulation through what the noble consciousness is doing. On the other side, we had the noble consciousness as, the obedience that was gaining honor, the person sort of identifying themselves with the state power, sacrificing their own selves, being virtuous. And then we had this individuality of the I that was never fully, you might say, suppressed or left behind or worked through, that was always there in the background. And here I'm just going to leave it as the I, because what's happening is, in a certain sense, an effacement of the I through flattery. So he's saying, look, the language is actually coming from the nobles, and it results in this effect of the unlimited monarch. So he says the heroism of silent service becomes, and isn't this a funny phrase, the heroism of flattery. There is still a kind of self-sacrificing taking place, but now it's occurring in language, in the social dimension, rather than in the realm of action. The noble consciousness is rendering something like obedience, rendering something like honor to the sovereign, to the person in charge, right? In the past, though, what was going on is there was an exchange. They were giving service, and they were getting honor and self-respect through that. Here, in a certain way, the nobles are being made less active. They're not being made less noble, at least not on paper, but they are being defamed. One of the things that Louis XIV did that was particularly smart on his part, although it did have far-reaching effects, was to say, okay, nobles, they don't get to stay in their own territories and rule over their domains from there, because if they do, they're too liable to raise private armies and get themselves mixed up in all sorts of seditions and affairs and private feuds between each other, and we don't want that sort of thing happening in our one single country. There's one ruler, everybody else needs to fall in line, so what do? You bring all the nobles to Versailles, and you have them hold court. And they, engage in all sorts of diverting activities which cost lots and lots of money. This is sort of the unintended side effects. But for the moment, it looks like it's quite a successful strategy. So the heroism of silent service becomes the heroism of flattery. He says, this vocal reflection of service constitutes the spiritual self-separating middle term. So in the previous paragraph, it was spirit that was mediating, right? Now it is language, and the language is coming from the noble consciousness. Now, of course, the noble consciousness, this is a little bit of an abstraction. The noble consciousness is not doing this totally on its own. It's drawing on the language that it has. I'm sure there's other people involved as well, all the apparatus of human beings and material that's required to make the noble consciousness have the sort of platform that he or she does. But it goes on and he says, it reflects back into itself not only its own extreme, but also reflects back into this self, the extreme of universal power. Here's the really important development. Making that power, which at first is only implicit, into a power that is explicit with an existence of its own. So, what we could say is it's not really the case that the unlimited monarch becomes the unlimited monarch because somebody, comes along and says, well, crap, I don't want to have any more of these revolutions or rebellions or private feuds or what have you taking place in my dimenses. I'm going to put a stop to this. No, the initiative is actually coming for Hegel here from the side of some of the nobles who are perhaps not even realizing what they're doing by increasing the power of the sovereign. and creating somebody who now it becomes state power as a person. When Louis XIV says, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. That's a perfect example of what's being talked about here. So what has been lacking before this was that state power existed and it functioned, but it didn't have this self-conscious will of its own, recognizing itself as a self-conscious will, becoming the dominant polarity in the entire thing. So that now the king, or whoever else is in charge, can say, not only am I the state, I am the common good. Service belongs to me, flattery belongs to me. So, this is something that the flattery of the nobles makes finally explicit, like he says. He says it makes it into a self-conscious individuality. And the result of this is the unlimited, unbeschränkte, if I remember right, monarch, unconditioned, the one who does not have limits placed upon him or her. Unlimited, he says. Why? Because the language of flattery raises this power into its purified universality. That is a really interesting observation. Why not unlimited because the king has all the guns? Why not unlimited because the king holds the treasury? Unlimited because of language. Unlimited because of the way culture functions. This is a really important point. When we talk about Hegel as being an idealist, I've said many times that Hegel, his form of idealism stresses that ideas have to become actual. But there's another side to it, which is to say, ideas matter sometimes so much that they do become actual by virtue of being ideas. You could say, whoever has the guns gets to decide everything, but no, it's the person who can talk the person who's got the guns or the swords or whatever it happens to be, the poison gas, into obeying them, into recognizing them as legitimate authority that has the power. So this is a really important point here. And let's go on. He says this is an unlimited monarch. Why? Because we have this purified universality, this moment being the product of language, of an existence which has been purified into spirit, is a purified self-identity, a monarch. Why? Because such language raises individuality to its extreme point. Now notice that Hegel does not say that the unlimited monarch becomes the unlimited monarch because of the flattery of the people, or because of a social contract, or because everybody all got together and recognized that things were more effective this way and this guy should be in charge and blah, blah. No, he says it's the nobles who are in the position to be able to, through their flattery, create the unlimited monarch as unlimited monarch through their language. Because their language matters. Their word matters. And now we get to something that Hegel is going to talk about here, which is very interesting, and we'll sort of redound back to the nobles in just a moment, but at first it belongs to the unlimited monarch. He says that expressed more definitely, it raises the individuality into an existence of pure form. How? By giving the monarch his own proper name. Now, does this mean, that they're able to say, this guy's Fred, or this guy's Henry? Yes, but his Henry is different than all the other Hanks out there. The monarch's name matters in a way that's different than everybody else's name. That's what Hegel's saying here in this passage. Look at how he portrays it. He says, here we go. It is in the name alone that the difference of the individual from everyone else is not presumed. not just posited, but made actual by all. In the name, the individual counts as a pure individual, no longer only in his own consciousness. We're all conscious of, hey, I'm Greg, and there's lots of other Gregs out there, but I'm this Greg. There's probably other Gregory B. Sadlers out there. I know there's plenty of Gregory Sadlers, there's a ton of Greg Sadlers, because it's a common name. But I am Gregory Sadler, the YouTube Hegel guy, right? That's more of a name in the sense that Hegel's talking about here. But now we're talking about somebody who actually has political power, who controls the state. The one that the state is really oriented around. This could be a king, could be an emperor, could be whatever we want. We don't even have to call it royal names. It just could be the ruler. And the ruler is the one who actually gets to have a name in this sense. So he says, by this name, the monarch is absolutely separated off from everybody else, exclusive and solitary. As monarch, he's a unique atom that cannot impart any of its essential nature. The name in this sense becomes the marker for somebody who is totally unique within the political community, within the Commonwealth, the one who drives the state power, the one whose will determines the state power. And the nobles have moved from a service of action to a service of flattery, a service of what might we call this here? The Hegel doesn't use the term recognition, anerkennen, right? And it's a one-sided recognition. What we see here is, in certain respects, a replication of what we saw previously in the Lord of the World, and the person who ends up controlling everything in the unhappy consciousness, right? So he goes on and he says, this name is the reflection into self, or the actuality which the universal power has in its own self. Through the name, the power is the monarch. There's something about being able to be articulated, and the name could take place not just through speech or writing, but perhaps even just through the seal, right? All of this enables the unlimited monarch to actually function in the way that he or she does. So he says, conversely, he, this particular individual, thereby knows himself, this individual, to be the universal power. They understand that they are in the position of power. And what is it that they know about the nobles? The nobles are oriented around them. The nobles, in effect, they don't hold court, they're held in court, right? They're made to show up. He says, he knows that the nobles are not only ready and prepared for the service of the state power, but, this is where it gets really interesting, they group themselves round the throne as an ornamental setting, like jewels in a setting, right? And that they are continually telling him who sits on it, what he is. The person who sits on the throne is continually being reminded by this service of who and what he is, the role, the function that he has, and his uniqueness in occupying that role. The language of their praise is in this way the spirit that in the state power itself unites the two extremes. It reflects the abstract power into itself and gives it the moment of the other extreme, the being for self that wills and decides, and by so doing gives it a self-conscious existence, or, otherwise expressed, this individual actual self-consciousness attains to the certain knowledge of itself as the power of the state. It is the point of the self into which the many points or selves, through renouncing their own inner certainty, are fused into one. Since, however, the spirit proper of state power consists in its obtaining actuality and nourishment from the sacrifice of action and thought by the noble consciousness, it is an independence that is self-alienated. The noble consciousness, the extreme of being for self, receives back the other extreme, that of actual universality, in return for the universality of thought which it relinquished. The power of the state is passed to the noble consciousness. In it, that power is first made truly effective. In the being for self of the noble consciousness, it ceases to be the inert entity which it appeared to be as the extreme of abstract being in itself. Considered as it is in itself, state power that is reflected into itself or has become spirit simply means that it has become a moment of self-consciousness. That is, it exists only as superseded. Consequently, it is now essence in the form of something, the spirit of which is that it is to be sacrificed and surrendered. That is, it exists as wealth. It does indeed at the same time have the continuing existence as a reality vis-a-vis wealth into which it is ever changing in accordance with its notion, but it is a reality whose notion is just this process of passing over by way of the service and honor done to it, and from which it derives its existence into its opposite, into the relinquishment of power. Thus the peculiar self that is its will knows that through the debasement of the noble consciousness it has become a universality that renounces itself, has become a completely separate and contingent individuality which is at the mercy of every more powerful will. What remains to it of universally acknowledged and incommunicable independence is the empty name. Paragraph 512 begins by talking about language, the language of praise, but then really is shifting back away from language, you might say, into the dialectic and the metaphysics of what is happening, or the social dynamics, if you prefer, having to do with state power, and ultimately reintroducing something that's been in the background this entire time, wealth. And remember, this is the dialectic of wealth and state power, the noble and the base consciousness. So by the end of this, we'd better see both wealth and the base consciousness, the ignoble consciousness, coming back in. So he tells us that the language of their praise is in this way the spirit that the state power itself, in the state power itself, unites the two extremes. What are the two extremes? The extreme of the abstract universal, the abstract power, right? And the other extreme, the being for self that wills and decides. Now, why is Hegel not at this point just talking about, say, the common good or the apparatus of the state and the unlimited monarch when he just brought that in the previous paragraph? Because being for self, this category of being for self, is going to be something that we're going to find now in the noble consciousness, and also dealt with in terms of wealth, which is coming back into the scene. So he says, what's happening here is that the state power has a self-conscious existence, right? He says, otherwise expressed, this individual actual self-consciousness, the absolute monarch, attains to the certain knowledge of itself as the power of the state. And whenever we see certain coming about, right, in this, we should always be thinking about, okay, where's the truth? Because Hegel almost always pairs truth and certainty together, and the truth is going to be more complex or at a higher level than mere certainty, mere Gewissheit, right? So he says that what we have here is the self. He calls it the point of the self into which the many points or selves, through renouncing their own inner certainty, are fused into one. Through having this absolute monarch, the nobles are giving something up. They're engaging in this process of flattery, but they're getting something. They're all fused into one thing. They find a locus, a place that has meaning for them, a place where they can really be the nobles that they want to be. You could say that the absolute monarch provides them with the stage, with the backdrop against which they can shine forth. So how does this play itself out then? Do things stop at this point? Hegel says no. He says, the spirit proper of state power consists in its obtaining actuality and nourishment from the sacrifice of action and thought by the noble consciousness, right? We talked in the previous paragraph about the noble consciousnesses are in effect providing recognition, anerkennen, to the unlimited monarch. Hegel is going to say that the unlimited monarch is himself alienated. Now, why is that the case? Doesn't he enjoy everything? These are all sacrificing, and these are the best other people. They're all sacrificing in action and thought and in language with flattery to this absolute monarch. Why is he alienated? It's a good question. Let's see what Hegel says. He says, the spirit proper of state power consists in obtaining actuality and nourishment from the sacrifice and action and thought. It's an independence that is self-alienated. The noble consciousness, the extreme of being for self, receives back the other extreme, that of actual universality. Hegel is not coming straight out and saying it, but the absolute monarch, the unlimited monarch, is losing something in the process. I mean, you might think about this. No one single person can really run the entire apparatus. They need something from these others. And so the rest of the state is going back to them in a certain respect. So he says, in return for the universality of thought, which it relinquished, the noble consciousness is receiving actual universality. So he says, in it, that power is first made truly effective. In the being for self of the noble consciousness, it ceases to be the inert entity which it appeared to be, the extreme of abstract being for itself. Being in itself, rather. So he says, considered as it is in itself, state power that is reflected into itself, or has become spirit, simply means it has become a moment of self-consciousness. It exists only as superseded, as aufgehoben. So we have a translation point here. We have a transcendence that is taking place. Something important along the way. Hegel goes on and he says, now its essence in the form of something, the spirit of which is that it is to be sacrificed and surrendered. This is kind of a big jump. Hegel says it exists as wealth. Now, why should we be bringing in wealth at this point? Why, given the dynamic that we've laid out here, should wealth reappear? Is it that, well, you've always got economics taking place and we kind of left that out for the moment? No, Hegel knows that. Hegel knows that if you want to have, a court, you need taxes. If you want to have troops, you got to have supply chains. Oh, yeah, that's all true, right? But wealth does something different here. Why is wealth now connected with the noble consciousness? Because the noble consciousness has become for itself in a different way than the being for self of the unlimited monarch. And it's a way that is more like wealth. Wealth is, the way that Hegel is discussing it here, kind of self-sacrificing. I mean, he's got this wonderful phrase where he says that we have a separate and contingent individuality which is at the mercy of every more powerful will. Isn't that a great way to sort of characterize the way that wealth works? Wealth can be used for whatever purposes we want. Whatever a person is willing gets to decide what the money is going to translate into. Right? So there's an analogy that's taking place here. I'm not sure that everyone will find it completely convincing, this transition, though. So he says, here we go. It does have a continuing existence as a reality vis-a-vis wealth, into which it is ever changing in accordance with its notion. But it is a reality whose notion is just this process of passing over, which itself is part of the way wealth works, right? State power is kind of static by comparison to wealth, because when Hegel's talking about wealth, he's talking about not just hard currency, but exchange, the entire process that generates goods, that swaps them between people, that increases over time. So he says, by way of the service and honor done to it, and from which it derives its existence, that was what the noble was working with before, into its opposite, into the relinquishment of power. So, The peculiar self that is its will knows that through the debasement of the noble consciousness, it has become a universality that renounces itself, has become a completely separate and contingent individuality, which is at the mercy of every more powerful will. The noble consciousness is now at the point of no longer truly being entirely the noble consciousness, because when it is noble, it sacrifices itself to the state power, and if it gives everything that it's got nothing left. And then it's no longer making a sacrifice of itself. If it holds something back, that which it holds back, it's for itself, is something contingent. The I that we were talking about before, which the next paragraph is going to go into again for us. So he says, what remains to it of universally acknowledged and incommunicable independence is the empty name. Is he talking here about the sovereign, the monarch, who we saw was given a name unlike any other name previously, or is he now talking about the name of the noble? It's not really clear just by the passage. I think that we should interpret this as the name of the noble rather than the name of the sovereign, because that is where the dialectical development is now taking place.